people are thinkers, some people are doers. I've always been the latter. I'm not sure just why, but I've never been comfortable unless I was doing something. I always felt more at home with an apron on and a spatula in my hand than I did sitting in the living room visiting with friends. Ever since I was a little girl, my father always complimented me for being a good worker. He seemed to always notice if I cleaned the house and was always appreciative after I helped a mother serve a good meal. Maybe it was that early appreciation, I don't know. For whatever reason, I kept that work ethic into adulthood. I guess it's just hard for me to sit down. I'm always thinking I should be up cleaning or dusting, fixing dinner, going to the market, or making plans to welcome guests. That's just me. I don't think I'll probably ever change. But now you may have guessed from your knowledge of Scripture that I am Martha, the sister of Lazarus and Mary. You probably remember me as one of the few people our Lord Jesus spoke rather harshly to. Let me tell you a little more about what happened that day. In fact, let me go back even farther and tell you what led up to the day. I suppose one of the advantages of being the kind of person I am is that I develop a reputation as a good hostess. I hope you don't think that I'm boasting when I say that if you would ask most people in Bethany who was the best hostess, they would probably tell you I was. I know that only because those same people had told me the same thing. And yes, I was rather proud of that. You may not think it a big deal, but I enjoyed the fact that people always felt they could drop by our house unannounced and know that they would be welcome, that they would feel at home, that they would find a good meal. And when people called me to help with their dinners and entertain, I always considered it a compliment. We had met Jesus several years before. We had gotten acquainted with him while he was still helping his father in the carpentry shop. There was something special about him. It was as if he always knew something much greater than being a carpenter was ahead for Jesus. After his baptism, after he began his public ministry, we knew that John the Baptist had been right. Jesus was the Messiah we had all waited for. Oh, I know that many didn't believe it was true, but I was convinced. I had seen the miracles Jesus performed, and no one could teach like that unless God was with him. To us, though, Jesus was more than a teacher, more than a prophet. Yes, even more than the Messiah. He was a friend. On more than one occasion, he told us how comfortable he felt coming to our house. You see, after Jesus began his ministry, he didn't have a house to come home to. He was constantly walking from one place to another, and our home became a kind of retreat for him. When he felt he needed rest or just wanted to get away from everyone for a while, he would stop by. I always liked to think I had something to do with that. Whenever I knew he was coming, I tried to fix the house up extra special, be sure to buy the kinds of things he liked to eat, and make sure I was ready to feed not only Jesus, but his disciples as well. Well, on that day you are thinking about, Jesus arrived a day earlier than I thought he would. So I really had to scurry to get everything ready and in order. I did want everything to be perfect, and I'm afraid I became more than a little cross with Mary when she wouldn't help. She sat in the other room listening to Jesus teach. You have to understand that in our day, men were supposed to be the teachers and the students. Women were supposed to be behind the scenes. Well, I told Mary to come and help several times, and when she wouldn't, I went to Jesus and asked if he would ask Mary to help. I surely didn't expect his answer. He said, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her." Not only did Jesus not ask Mary to help me, he chimed me for not being more like Mary. I was hurt when he first said it, but later I was able to understand what he meant. Partly he was saying that it was all right for women to learn and to know about God. Partly he was saying we all have different gifts. He wasn't so much speaking against my gifts of service as he was speaking for the need to know the Lord's will. You see, Jesus had a way of helping people to feel that they were truly needed, regardless of the gifts they had. Even though the account that I just shared with you is probably the one you most often think of when you think of me, Another event that is really far more important occurred later on. You see, our brother Lazarus got really sick. No one could figure out what was wrong with him. Nothing we did seemed to make any difference. If only Jesus was here, I thought. I had seen him heal every disease, but he wasn't in Bethany at the time. I asked one of our friends to go to Jesus and tell him about Lazarus. I knew that if Jesus understood how sick our brother was, he would come right away. Unfortunately, Jesus was teaching some distance away, and by the time he got to Bethany, Lazarus had died. In fact, we had buried him in the family burial cave 4 days earlier. We were all in the house observing the normal period of mourning, along with many friends from town when news came of Jesus' arrival. I immediately ran out to meet him. I suppose that was just like me, as Mary stayed behind. When I saw Jesus, I was filled with relief at the sight of our friend, but I also felt a kind of anger that he hadn't been there when we really needed him. And so when I came near to him, I blurted out, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that wherever you asked of God, God would give it to you. I don't know what I was asking Jesus to do. I just wish he had come earlier." Jesus looked at me and said, "Your brother will rise again." I thought he was talking about the resurrection at the end of the time. Jesus had told us about that, even though the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. I did, and I knew Jesus was right. We would all rise from the dead at the end of time. And so I said, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Then he said something that I will never forget. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." And then he asked me, "Do you believe this?" I was sure Jesus was the Messiah, no matter what anyone else said. And so I said, "Yes, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming in the world." Yes, I did believe Jesus was the Christ. I believed he was the Messiah, but I would have never believed what happened next if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. First off, I went to get Mary because Jesus asked about her. When she came to Jesus, she said the same thing. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw how much he had been crying, you could see his face change. He walked to the tomb, and then Jesus asked for the stone to be taken away. You have to understand, we didn't know all you know about embalming, and it was hot outside. So we knew the odor would be terrible if they took the stone away. But Jesus insisted. Then he fell to his knees and prayed. But it was more than a prayer. It was like thanking God for an answer to a prayer. I didn't understand what was happening until he stood up and shouted at the top of his voice, "Lazarus, come out!" We all stood up there, not knowing what to say or do or even think. Then, before our very eyes, still wrapped in grave clothes, Lazarus appeared at the door of the tomb. He was alive! He was alive! Jesus had given life back to Lazarus. After 4 days dead in the tomb, he was alive. Jesus simply said, "Unbind him and let him go." We rushed forward to take the wrappings off. We couldn't get there fast enough. Lazarus was stunned, to say the least. We were all stunned. At first, everyone shouted, clapped their hands, and couldn't stop talking. Then everyone was so quiet, it was as though the realization of what happened started to sink in. People didn't know what to say or even what to think. All I know is that it was the happiest day of my life. We had Lazarus back. From that day on, how could anyone doubt that Jesus was exactly who he said he was? Unfortunately, that is not how the religious authorities reacted. Instead of rejoicing in the power of God, they saw this miracle as a direct threat and began to plot to put Jesus to death. They were afraid everyone would start following him. Little did they know how right they were. Had I had known what lay ahead for Jesus, I wouldn't have even began to pray for Lazarus' healing. Soon we heard Jesus had been arrested. When we got to Jerusalem, we heard talk of crucifixion. How could anyone think such a thing? How could anyone do such a thing? Anyone who knew Jesus knew that the only thing he ever did was love people. His whole life had been given to helping people, healing people, teaching people. How could he talk about death? I'll never forget the sight of Jesus carrying the cross through the streets of Jerusalem, nor the scene that day at Calvary. My whole world came crashing in. I wish I had died before, so I wouldn't have been there. It was the longest Passover of my life. There was no joy in this Passover. That is, until Sunday, when we began to hear reports of people seeing Jesus alive. Some wouldn't believe until they saw for themselves. I didn't have to see to believe. I was there when Lazarus came from the grave. I knew it was true. And suddenly, everything was all right again. If you want to remember Jesus rebuking me in the kitchen, that's okay. But please also remember my statement of faith. You are the Christ, the Son of God. And please, don't just remember. Claim Jesus' promise. Claim the life Jesus has given back to you.